Good evening, I'm Klaudia Czerwińska and you're watching World News Tonight live from Warsaw. Poland's president is open to the country having its own nuclear deterrent as Europe continues to move away from American dependence. We'll have more on that for you in just a moment, but first, tonight's headlines. Marco Rubio says Orban is Washington's man in Europe. Moscow is using Wagner for hybrid attacks on the continent. Full steam ahead, Poland and Germany are strengthening their railway cooperation. President Karol Nawrocki believes Poland should begin work on its nuclear deterrent. This comes as Washington's interest in European security wanes, forcing the continent to think differently. Our defense correspondent Zuzanna Jurek unpacks what could this mean for Poland and the region.
Appetite for a European nuclear deterrent appears to be growing. And it's not just the Western European nuclear know-how countries which are showing increased eagerness, but Poland too, where the President Karol Nawrocki appears to be becoming enthusiastic for the atomic.
I am a strong proponent of Poland joining the nuclear project. We are a country lying right on the border of an armed conflict, and we know the attitude of the aggressive Imperial Russian Federation towards Poland.
The ambiguous words of the Polish president have prompted numerous debates. Specifically, what exactly might the president have in mind?
He did mention international agreements and that he, respects those. And that's a clear nod to the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, of which Poland is a signatory. So Poland cannot, at the moment, even work towards developing its own nuclear weapons. I suspect the more likely direction is with regards to nuclear sharing within NATO.
At the same time, the timing of his statement does not seem coincidental, particularly with budding nuclear talks taking place primarily in Paris and Berlin.
We engaged a strategic dialogue, obviously with Chancellor Merz, but with few European leaders, with special cooperation, common exercises, and common security interests with some key countries. This is exactly what we are doing for the first time in history with Germany.
And while the words of the Polish president suggest an appetite for nuclear warheads from Warsaw, the Polish defense minister stated that although the country remains committed to allied decision-making, increase within the country know-how is always welcomed.
Certainly, the nuclear sharing program and the nuclear umbrella are always subjects of NATO analysis and joint allied decisions. The French president's openness regarding the nuclear umbrella is also welcome. That said, I am also always in favor of seeking to strengthen our own research and development capabilities. However, regarding nuclear weapons, it is better to have extensive discussions away from the public eye.
And while most officials in Europe remain staunchly committed to the principle that the NATO's nuclear capabilities, the backbone of the alliance's deterrence, rests within the remit of the designated bodies.
I think nuclear issues are best discussed behind closed doors and preferably at the nuclear planning group at NATO.
We have to understand that right now the nuclear deterrence is most credible and most strongest from United States.
This is a big day.
An increasing number of countries, particularly the Nordic members, including Sweden and Finland, are not discounting the possibility that in the not-so-distant future, taking greater responsibility for their own defences may also mean a European nuclear umbrella.
This is a discussion, acute need to be discussed in Europe. And I don't think that this discussion will go anywhere.
There's a question if the time is now, something that would be parallel to the activities in NATO, but I think something that would also be noted by Russia, because ultimately we are not doing it for ourselves, but we're also doing it to signal the cohesion of Europe and the credibility of our deterrence posture.
Equally, however, others note it's too early to jump the gun just yet.
The idea that Europe at the moment can do without the American nuclear umbrella is a bit of a fallacy. Preserving the transatlantic link for the purposes of nuclear deterrence remains necessary for the time being and in foreseeable future.
TVP World reached out to the presidential office with a request for clarification on the president's stance on nuclear weapons for Poland, but has yet to receive a response. For TVP World, Zuzanna Jurek.
The United States and Russia continue to pressure Ukraine to hold elections despite the war raging on. President Zelenskyy says he is open to elections if a ceasefire can be agreed upon with Russia and ensured by the United States. For more from Ukraine, let's go to our correspondent in Kyiv, Oz Karaji. Good evening, Oz. So there's international pressure to have Ukraine hold elections, which would not only be difficult in practice, but also in terms of its legality. Is there a fear that the U.S. is not going to willingly sign the security guarantees if Ukraine does not hold an election before the deadline?
Well, this was something that President Zelenskyy moved to dismiss last week on Wednesday, following an explosive report in the Financial Times that President Zelenskyy was about to announce an election and a referendum on a potential peace deal between Ukraine and Russia on the 24th of February, something Zelenskyy said last week on Wednesday, that this was the first he had heard of such a thing. And he then later went on to also dismiss the idea that U.S. security guarantees were tied to Ukraine holding elections in the near future under a deadline by the United States. Now, it's very true that the United States has been pressuring Ukraine about elections. This is something that's open record. President Trump has said it openly. President Zelenskyy has mentioned it as well. So this is something that's understood. But for the most part, Kyiv is denying that there's any link between that pressure which exists and a link between the security guarantees that Ukraine feels it needs to be in place for them to even hold an election. And that, you know, quite simply would involve the suspension of martial law or passing a law that allows for elections to be held under martial law. And while this invasion is at the state that it's in, there's just no chance of that happening on the political timeline that currently exists. So if something changes in the near future, if there is some sort of ceasefire agreement that will be brokered by these negotiations, then maybe we'll be discussing that. But at the moment, there is no such prospect on the table. And as far as Kyiv is concerned, there are no pressures from the US to hold an election that are linked to security guarantees. That pressure about elections does still exist, though.
Oz, on a slightly different note, Herman Halushchenko, Ukraine's former energy minister, has been charged with money laundering and organized crime as part of the country's biggest corruption scandal. What do we know so far? What are the details?
Well, Herman Halushchenko, who was the Minister for Energy, who resigned in 2025 when that National Anti-Corruption Bureau and Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office investigation kicked off into the graft probe behind Energoatom, that's the state-owned nuclear power agency. More than $100 million in kickbacks and bribes reportedly involved in this scheme known as the Midas scheme. Now, Mr. Halushchenko was reportedly arrested on a train that was leaving Kyiv for Poland, for Warsaw. And he has been charged by the Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office in relation to money laundering and potential criminal activities. Now, it must be said this is just a charge. There's been no, he hasn't been convicted of anything, but this is a part of a wider graft probe, which has already caused the resignation of Andriy Yermak, President Zelensky's former chief of staff. So this has had a major shakeup on Ukrainian politics. There's no sign that the National Anti-Corruption Bureau or the Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office are planning on slowing down any of these investigations, no matter how uncomfortable they may make some in Ukraine's ruling class, including in Zelensky's administration. But these prosecutions are now ongoing. And as you're seeing, we've been reporting along the process of these suspicions being offered. But now we're at the stage of people being charged with crimes. So it will be very interesting to see how these proceed under wartime and how these trials will take place in the near future.
Thank you so much. Reporting from Kyiv Live, this was Oz Katerji. What was meant to serve as a meeting on bilateral relations and nuclear energy turned into an endorsement session for the current Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán. Marco Rubio said that President Donald Trump is committed to Orbán's success as his opposition leads in the polls. Andrew Sweeney reports from Budapest.
The meeting between Marco Rubio and Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orbán was slated to discuss nuclear energy and bilateral relations, but of course the great elephant in the room is the upcoming general election on April 12th. President Donald Trump has already endorsed Orbán twice as his anti-EU Fidesz faces a serious challenge from the pro-EU TISA party, led by former Fidesz Minister Peter Magyar. It's currently 11% ahead in the polls, but Rubio made it clear the US wants Orbán to remain in power.
I can say to you with confidence that President Trump is deeply committed to your success because your success is our success. because this relationship we have here in Central Europe through you is so essential and vital for our national interests in the years to come.
Of course, the countries of Central Europe were singled out in Trump's national security doctrine, and his administration is actively supporting parties in Europe that are patriotic, as he puts it, that are anti-EU or Eurosceptic. Rubio said that relations between Hungary and the US are experiencing a golden age, exemplified by the deal on nuclear energy cooperation. It's similar to one signed between the States and Slovakia's Prime Minister Robert Fico's, Orbán's key ally in the EU's so-called awkward squad. As for Magyar, he said he'd be happy to welcome Rubio back to Budapest when Tisza, as he puts it, wins the election, when he would meet the new foreign minister, another Orbán, Anita Orbán.
It is always good news when the top diplomat of one of Hungary's most important allies visits our country. We warmly welcome U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio to Budapest on October 23rd, the 70th anniversary of the 1956 Hungarian Revolution. By then, he will be received by a different Orbán, Anita Orbán. What will not change, however, is our commitment to strengthening Hungarian-American relations.
Though repairing relations with Brussels is a priority for Magyar, he has said that he would not support the bloc's migrant pact and that he's against fast-track membership for Ukraine. However, he has also pledged to return former Polish ministers Marcin Romanowski and Zbigniew Ziobro, whom Viktor Orban granted asylum, back to Warsaw to face justice in their trials for corruption and abuse of power. Will he be able to do that? We'll find out on April 12th. In the meantime, we're likely to see more US administration officials visit the country, perhaps Donald Trump. And there will be more accusations from Prime Minister Orbán of outside interference, both from the EU and from Ukraine, which she says is trying to turn the election in Tisza's favour. For TVP World in Budapest, Andrew Sweeney.
Russian hybrid attacks in Europe, like the one on Poland's railways, may be coordinated by former members of the Wagner Group, with the Kremlin using the group's former members to build a shadow network across the continent. Alex Cadier has more on this new use of an old Russian proxy.
In Poland, a couple of weeks ago, we had an attack that was clearly meant to kill Polish citizens. A group of saboteurs set off a bomb which was designed to derail a Polish train.
A bomb on Polish railways, damage to infrastructure in the Baltic Sea, drone incursions in Poland, Denmark and Belgium, and constant waves of cyber attacks and disinformation. Russia's hybrid war has become all too familiar in Europe. The Kremlin's actions have prompted bordering countries to beef up security around civilian infrastructure, in case Moscow's provocations end up going too far. And now it seems Russia's hybrid war has a new but familiar face. Remember them? The notorious Wagner Group is best known for its incursion against Russian forces, but now some of its former members have been charged with waging a hybrid war in Europe for the Kremlin. According to the Financial Times, ex-Wagner members are now trying to recruit young men in Europe to commit acts of sabotage. From arson attacks to attacks on naval infrastructure and weaponizing migration, Russia's intelligence services continue to recruit economically vulnerable European men to do their dirty work. In the wake of the hybrid attack on the railways in Poland, I asked NATO's Secretary General what can be done.
If this happens again, we will again do more. So Russia, you have to know, we will create these asymmetric reactions. We will not blow up railway lines in Russia, but we will make sure you feel if you do stuff like this.
So Europe is now equipping itself to counter some of Russia's hybrid threats, but with the Kremlin turning to old Wagner recruiters to find willing accomplices across the continent, the threat could yet still come from inside European borders. Alex Cadier, TVP World.
Next stop on the high-speed train, Poland. Soon enough, commuters from across the country will be able to travel between major Polish cities in no time, while cooperation on high-speed rail between Poland and Germany could make international travel faster than ever before. Maciej Wilowski has more on these investments, the meeting of Polish and German infrastructure ministers in Warsaw, and what it means for the planned Port Polska infrastructure hub.
High-speed rail is coming to Poland. Starting around 2035, commuters and travelers from all across the country will have the option to travel between major cities like Warsaw, Łódź, Poznań, and Wrocław through high-speed rail, which will not only make travel times faster, but it will increase connectivity with international destinations like Berlin and Prague. Seeking to capitalize on this opportunity, the infrastructure ministers of Germany and Poland met here in Warsaw near the central railway station where I'm standing right now to discuss future investments in high-speed rail.
Among other things, we want to conduct analytical work, the goal of which will be to shorten travel times, increase the number of rail connections, and foster cooperation between Polish and German firms.
This analysis could be vital in planning future high-speed rail connections between large cities, including Warsaw and Berlin or Wrocław and Leipzig.
We would like, on the basis of our agreement, to start construction on the most modern high-speed rail network in all of Europe, to serve as an example for the world.
Poland's first stretch of high-speed track, expected in 2032, will pass through Port Polska, a future infrastructure hub which will combine high-speed rail connections with a new national airport expected to serve as close to 30 million passengers a year. The push for high-speed rail comes amid record ridership by train. Last year, state-owned rail operator PKP Intercity recorded over 89 million passengers riding its trains, a 14% increase compared to 2024. It's expected to hit 96 million passengers this year. And while these joint investments are still many years off into the future, new connections in high-speed rail among Central European countries could make the region more interconnected than ever before. For TVP World, I'm Maciej Wilowski.
Warsaw's Vietnamese community welcomed the Lunar New Year with fireworks at 6 p.m. Warsaw time on Monday. Considered a close family holiday in Vietnam, the celebration is an opportunity for the tight-knit community to mark an important milestone in the lunar calendar. Natalia Komarov took part in the celebrations and has this next report.
Tonight, Vietnam celebrates Tet, or the Lunar New Year. Here in Warsaw at Bakalarska Street, which is the heart of Warsaw's Vietnamese community, many came to celebrate with their loved ones.
During Vietnamese holiday, we tend to gather, like family gathering, friends gathering, like celebrate what happens during the whole year, and we usually had hot pots, like finger food and stuff. Yeah.
Between 30 and 40,000 Vietnamese live in Poland and a few thousand here in Warsaw. They are the third biggest minority group, just behind Ukrainians and Belarusians. The Asian town on Bakalarska Street is where the Vietnamese get their everyday groceries, and this is also where they gather to celebrate special moments in life.
I'm living here to studying, and I don't have a family here, but everyone around me is my family also. So yeah, that's different about in Poland and between Poland and Vietnam.
The fireworks went off at midnight, Hanoi time. Here in Warsaw, it was 6 p.m.
Happy New Year's is like chúc mừng năm mới. It's from Vietnam.
And so, happy Lunar New Year to all those who celebrate. For TVP World, Natalia Komarov.
And now time for tonight's interview to talk about Ukraine, a possibility of spring elections, U.S. and Russian pressure, and more. I'm joined by Stephen Moore, founder of the Ukraine Freedom Project. Stephen, great to have you back in the studio.
Always
Thanks for
great
coming.
to be with you.
So, peace talks for Ukraine round 3, set to take place tomorrow. If these talks do not bring any results, because Russia is actively doing anything not to reach a ceasefire, why do they take place in the first place, and what is the expected outcome, considering that we've already seen some meetings take place and we had little results?
What's happened, exactly. And Putin does not want peace. Putin wants peace talks, because you notice that every time that Europe and the United States come together, or that every time that Lindsey Graham says his bill on sanctions, Russian sanctions, is got the green light to go, Putin calls Trump and says, "Well, I'm ready for peace. Let's talk." And And of course, he does that and then launches 500 drones into Ukraine and kills a bunch of civilians.
And according to the words of President Zelenskyy, there's going to be a massive attack that Ukraine is actually getting ready for in the next few days.
Yeah, I mean, this is episode 3 or more of what we've been seeing for the last year, which is that Putin talks about peace. He doesn't actually make any concessions. Ukraine is negotiating against itself right now, and then he launches attacks against Ukrainian civilians, and so Putin is not going to stop until someone makes him stop. And I think the hopeful thing that's happened recently is that Trump made India promise to stop buying Russian oil. If that happens, that's 18.
Yes.
Yeah, that's 18% of Russia's fossil fuels. 18% of their revenue from fossil fuels.
And Russia is already wondering where to send its oil.
Yeah, that's nice. It'd be nice to have that problem of having that ghost fleet of 1,000, illegal tankers filled with oil floating around the ocean with no place to go. That would be super fun. But if that happens, then that's going to be a game changer, because Putin, to get people to go fight in Ukraine, it's almost certain death to go fight in Ukraine if you're Russian. There's 1.2 million soldiers that have been lost so far by the Russians. And so to get them to fight in Russia, Putin has to pay them a life-changing amount of money. And an American entry-level soldier gets $2,000 a month. I've heard reports that a Russian entry-level soldier makes $8,000 a month. And if you consider the difference in purchasing power, it's an extraordinary amount of money. And the death benefits for a soldier, if you can find a dog tag, is about $200,000. So it cost Putin a lot of money, and if he stops getting that kind of money in, he gets a real problem.
I would like us to take a look at a discussion around Ukraine that's been going on for some time right now. The U.S. is pushing for the presidential elections to take place in Ukraine before the May deadline. This, from a constitutional and practical standpoint, is impossible, as we've learned. How do you think that President Zelenskyy is going to be able to convince the U.S. to sign the security guarantees and make the administration understand that Ukraine is not the problem when it comes to organizing the elections, because there is a will, but there is no way, because there is no ceasefire that is lasting?
Yeah, exactly. To have Ukrainians line up to vote is just creating a very large target for Vladimir Putin to kill more civilians. And so if you can't get a ceasefire agreement, then it's ludicrous to think you can have an election. And I'll tell you a couple other things. One is the polls show the Ukrainian people want a military party. They want military leadership. Certainly understandable in today's climate in Ukraine. And that group of people cannot campaign because they're at the front, right? Then the second part of it is, who's going to go be the election monitors at the front? Yeah, I'll go, but but there's not a lot of folks that are volunteering to go to the front to make sure the ballot boxes are treated fairly. So,
and I mean, considering the humanitarian situation across the country and Kyiv in particular, when you think about basic needs of people who are supposed to go and vote are not being taken care of, how are they going to focus on who they're going to vote for?
It's a little tricky. It is. Again, it's something that Putin has put out there. Putin, who has elections, but he pushes his political opponents out of windows. Anyone out there, go Google defenestration. It's the word throwing someone or something out of a window. It's Putin's favorite English word.
I would like us to revisit the topic of the meeting, which is set to take place tomorrow. Russia is making it very clear that the territorial concessions and the discussion revolving that very subject is going to be on top of their agenda. Russia wants Donbass. They made it very clear. We know that Vladimir Medinsky, who is the chief negotiator on the Russian side, is definitely going to push for it. Do you think that Russia is going to get what it wants?
No. And there is no appetite among the Ukrainian people to give up Donbass. And we polled it. The polling shows that like 60 or 70% of Ukrainians don't want to give up that territory, depending on how you phrase it. And so, because the worst things in the world are happening to the 3.5 million people who currently live in occupied Ukraine. It's no secret how Putin will govern these areas because he's already shut down every church in occupied Ukraine he doesn't control. He is, the Russian Orthodox Church has declared a holy war on Ukraine in the West, and the soldiers that follow the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine have taken that to heart because they've killed 80 pastors and priests. So, it is a terrible place to live. Ukrainians don't want any more of their people under that sort of rule, and so there's no interest in doing that.
What we've covered here on the program is Russia and Moscow using the members of the Wagner Group that we thought might have been disbanded as part of their operations, especially when it comes to hybrid attacks across Europe. We've heard that in a report by our correspondent Alex Cadier. Do you think that European countries are actually equipped to deal with this sort of threat?
Well, first off, my theory is that Prigozhin's still alive, and he's had some plastic surgery, and he's doing his work elsewhere. But that's just my theory.
I'll quote you on it.
But yeah, look, this is the way they're doing it. It is amazing to me. Bart de Wever, who is the Prime Minister of Belgium, sat in a Ukraine breakfast at Davos just 2 or 3 weeks ago and said, we're not at war with Russia. Europe's not at war with Russia. And so he justified not using the $200 billion in frozen Russian assets to help Ukraine because Belgium and Europe is not at war with Russia. That's what Prime Minister de Wever thinks of Belgium. But Putin doesn't think that. The other thing that Belgium is doing is sending enough money for liquid natural gas to Moscow every day to fund fund 131 Shahed drones for Putin to send into to Ukraine. So when you look at this, you got to wonder, where's his head at? Where's the rest of Western Europe? It turns out, I don't know if you saw this recently, but the Indian oil, when they started purchasing all the Russian oil, the refined products were all purchased by Europe. So Russia is attacking Europe. Western Europe doesn't care. Poland and the Baltic states and the Scandinavian states, this group of northern Eastern European countries, you guys care. Poland's aware. Poland sees the brunt of these attacks. But
Poland has a diversified portfolio when it comes to energy.
Yeah. Thank you for that. But yeah, so Europe, France buys about as much LNG every day as the Belgians, as does Spain. And so, and again, there's 3 attacks by Russian drones that shut down Brussels airport. Again, 3 times. So Belgium is paying Russia to attack Belgium. It is just crazy. And someone needs to change that attitude. Europe needs to figure out it's a war.
Just before we go, because I am aware of the fact that our time is coming to an end on the program, but Herman Halushchenko, Ukraine's former energy minister, he's been charged with, let me help myself with the notes, money laundering and organized crime as part of the country's biggest corruption scandal. How do you think this continuing corruption scandal in Ukraine is going to reflect on Ukraine, and how is it going to, are we going to see actually more prominent figures in the Ukrainian government or the structures of power that are going to be affected?
Yeah, I actually think that things are going in the right direction on that. And if you look at this, the guy was trying to flee across the border guards got him and took him back to Kyiv, and now he's in chains. That's the way it's supposed to work. And so you see a lot of that. There's scandals in Ukraine, and the scandals at our high levels, and the people are in jail. So I look in America, and the 2008 financial crisis, like one person went to jail for that. And so this is the way it's supposed to work. And I think that Yermak is gone, and things are going a lot better, a lot more in the right direction. So, under Yermak, the prime minister, not prime minister, he was the former head of the office of the president in Ukraine. So, look, I think things are going in the right direction.
Thank you, Stephen. Stephen Moore, founder of the Ukraine Freedom Project, was my guest on the program. Great to have you as always. Thank you. And so this would be all for now here on World News Tonight. I'm Klaudia Czerwińska. Please stay tuned for more. We have Adam Yasser coming up next, so tune for that as well.